Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. This case isn't just about murder, it's about the dark undercurrent of humanity. It's a story of misplaced trust, innocence stolen, and a community forever shaken by two faces of evil hiding in plain sight. It begins with a name. Angie. It started as a missing persons case. Angie had vanished without a trace, and for 9 agonizing days, her family clung to the hope that she might still be alive. That maybe, just maybe, she'd walk back through the door. But that hope shattered when authorities discovered human remains, quietly buried beneath discarded items in a rural stretch of land. Among the belongings were school notebooks with Angie's name scribbled on them, each letter a punch to the gut. What came next was worse. When the remains were transferred to the medical examiner, the full scope of her final hours came to light. The tape wrapped around her head was carefully peeled away, and beneath it, a horrifying detail emerged, a piece of underwear stuffed into her mouth, a cruel attempt to silence her even in death. The autopsy confirmed every parent's nightmare. Angie hadn't been killed right away. She had been held captive for over a week, suffering in silence, before she was left to die alone, freezing in the elements. She'd been sexually assaulted. Her body bore the bruises and trauma of the nightmare she endured. Forensics scoured the evidence, combing through every fiber, every strand, every fingerprint. And they found one, pressed into the tape that had sealed her fate. But when they ran it through the database, there was nothing. No matches. No breakthrough. And so the investigation dragged forward, haunted by the weight of failure. The brutality of Angie's death shocked the community into a state of fear. Parents started walking their children to bus stops. Backyards became off-limits. People started locking their doors a little earlier and watching their neighbors a little more closely. But fear wasn't done with them yet. Just weeks later, on December 1st, another little girl disappeared. Her name was Cassidy. 10 years old. Bright, bubbly, and full of life. She had asked her mom for permission to visit friends just a few houses down. That walk should have taken minutes. She never made it. The similarities were impossible to ignore: another young girl, another small town, another shattered family. Detectives widened their net, now entertaining a chilling theory: was there a serial predator lurking among them? Could Angie and Cassidy have crossed paths with the same killer? Or were there two monsters walking side by side? 10 long days passed. Then, another body. Cassidy was found in St. Louis, wrapped in bed sheets and hidden beneath a pink curtain, as if someone had tried, feebly, to cover up what they'd done. Her cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. No fingerprints. No DNA. No smoking gun. Just questions, and the unbearable grief of another family burying their child. Investigators wrestled with the possibility of a connection, but there were critical differences. Angie's abduction had the hallmarks of long-term captivity and calculated cruelty. Cassidy's death, though brutal, seemed more panicked, impulsive. Could it really be the same person? Then, a name surfaced: Gary. 37 years old, a man with a history. He'd tried to abduct a girl not long before Angie disappeared and regularly traveled to St. Louis for work. Suspicious? Absolutely. But when detectives dug into his whereabouts, he had an airtight alibi. He wasn't their killer, not for Angie or Cassidy. But he wasn't innocent either. He eventually confessed to assaulting 4 other girls and was sent to prison. Justice, but not closure. Then came a break, one that would crack open the case. When Cassidy's body was found, investigators noticed something most might overlook: tire tracks. A distinct pattern that matched a specific model of pickup truck, a vehicle type commonly rented from a well-known car rental company, marked by its bright, unmistakable logos. Police canvassed Cassidy's neighborhood again. Had anyone seen one of these trucks? One woman said yes. She remembered seeing the vehicle near her neighbor's house, a house shared by a woman, her husband, and her brother. Detectives knocked on the door. The woman inside claimed none of them had rented a truck, and they had no idea what the police were talking about. Something didn't sit right. Detectives secured a search warrant. What they found in the basement was nothing short of chilling. Traces of blood, Cassidy's blood. The murder weapon. A crime scene hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The trail led to the woman's brother, Thomas. Under pressure, he cracked. He confessed. According to Thomas, Cassidy had come to the house that day to ask if his nephews could come out and play. He invited her inside. Led her down to the basement. And then, it all spiraled. He attempted to assault her. She screamed. He panicked. He grabbed something heavy and struck her. Then, he wrapped her in bed sheets and left her lifeless body there. He went to work like it was any other day. When he came home, his sister confronted him, having discovered what he had done. She didn't want the details. She just wanted it gone. So the body stayed in the basement for a week. Hidden. Waiting. Until Thomas finally rented the pickup truck, drove to St. Louis, and left Cassidy's body there like discarded trash. Thomas was sentenced to death. But fate had other plans. He died in prison from illness before the sentence could be carried out. Even in his final days, Thomas denied having anything to do with Angie's death. Detectives believed him, at least on that point. The cases were different enough. Maybe Angie's killer was still out there, walking free. Time passed. Leads ran dry. Hope flickered. Years later, in 2001, the reward for information in Angie's case was set to expire. It was a desperate move to reignite interest, to push the public to come forward before the case went fully cold. They needed something, anything. Because Angie still didn't have justice. And somewhere, someone knew the truth. $50,000. That was the reward put forward by donors desperate to see justice served in Angie Hausman's haunting case. It was a massive amount, enough to stir hope and light a fire under dormant leads. The phones at the police station rang non-stop, tips flooded in, and for a moment, it felt like a breakthrough was within reach. But as the dust settled, reality struck hard. Despite the surge in information, none of it led anywhere. Not a single clue panned out. Angie's case remained just as cold, just as cruel. Then, in 2001, almost a decade after Angie was taken, a twist emerged that made headlines. Corey Fox, an inmate serving time, came forward with a chilling confession. He claimed he'd killed Angie, along with several others. He spoke in disturbing detail, about how Angie had been abducted, gagged with her own underwear, tied to a tree. It was graphic, horrifying, and eerily familiar. The public gasped. Had the monster finally been found? But detectives, experienced and skeptical, dug deeper. They started to notice cracks in his story. Corey said her hands were bound with plastic handcuffs, but the original reports confirmed they were iron. Other parts of his tale didn't match up either. It became evident that Corey had likely pieced together his confession from media reports and public information. He wanted attention, and Angie's case, so widely covered and deeply mourned, was his twisted ticket to notoriety. Then, in 2002, another tragedy shook the community. A 6-year-old girl was abducted and murdered. For a moment, people wondered if it was connected to Angie. But the killer in this case, a neighbor, confessed quickly. It was unrelated, but it reopened old wounds and reminded everyone that Angie's real killer still walked free. In 2007, a new set of eyes took another look at the dusty case files. A fresh detective team combed through every document, every photograph, every overlooked note. That's when they stumbled upon a man named Roger Martin. His name had barely made a blip during the original investigation. He had been spotted in a parked car near where Angie's body was discovered. When questioned, Roger claimed he was out hunting. But there was no hunting gear in his car. And there was something else, his criminal record. Disturbing offenses involving children, including an assault near the very area Angie's body was dumped. These crimes predated Angie's murder, but back then, no one followed up. When Roger was finally brought in for questioning, he denied everything. Said he was just passing through, said he was still at work when Angie's body was placed in the woods. Detectives grilled him for 9 hours, hoping he'd crack. He didn't. They took his fingerprints, compared them to those on the duct tape used on Angie, but no match. Without solid evidence, they had to let him go. The case once again grew cold. Until 2018. The St. Louis Police Department formed a special task force. Their mission: use new technology to re-examine the evidence that had stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. 3 key pieces were prioritized: the handcuffs, the tape, and the underwear used to silence Angie. But time had not been kind to any of them. The handcuffs were contaminated with Angie's blood. The tape had degraded beyond recovery. The underwear, once considered the least likely to yield results, was their final shot. And then, against all odds, a miracle happened. Deep in the fabric, buried and nearly erased by time, they found it. A sliver of male DNA. Just enough. They sent it to the FBI database. Usually, this part is the beginning of another long, exhausting wait. DNA often yields no matches. But this time, a hit came back almost instantly. Earl Webster Cox. He was 58 years old, locked away in federal prison since 2003. Until then, Cox had never even been considered in connection to Angie's murder. But his history? It was a map of darkness. In 1982, while serving in the military in Germany, he babysat children. That ended when 4 young girls accused him of sexual abuse. He was extradited to the US and sentenced to 8 years, but walked free after just 3. In 1992, fresh out of prison, Cox moved to St. Louis. The following year, Angie vanished. Then in 2002, the full scope of Cox's depravity was exposed. The FBI had been hunting him for running a vast online platform for child exploitation. A sting operation brought him down. He thought he was meeting a 14-year-old girl he planned to turn into a slave. He sent her money for a bus ticket, but the girl was an undercover agent. Armed officers were waiting. When they arrested him, they found more than 45,000 images of abuse on his computer. He wasn't just a user, he was the ringleader. 60 others were arrested because of him. It was one of the largest busts of its kind. He was sentenced to 10 years. But when his time was up, a judge kept him locked away using a rare legal clause. Cox was declared too dangerous to be released. In 2019, that sliver of DNA linked him to Angie. Detectives visited him in prison. This time, the silence was different. The science had spoken. The match was undeniable. But Cox? He denied it. Lawyered up. Refused to cooperate. Still, justice had finally opened its eyes. After 26 long years of silence, lies, and dead ends, the face behind Angie Hausman's nightmare had a name. And this time, the evidence wouldn't fade away. The evidence stacked against him was impossible to ignore. Investigators knew that if they took David Earl Cox to trial, his chances of walking free were next to none. But rather than drag the case through a courtroom battle, they made a move that would bring long-awaited answers. Prosecutors approached Cox's lawyer with a deal. If he confessed to the murder of 9-year-old Angie Hausman, the state would remove the death penalty from the table and instead seek life in prison without parole. Faced with the grim reality of the evidence against him, Cox agreed. Detectives made their way back to the prison to hear what he had to say. The details that came out were disturbing, unsettling, and in some parts, hard to believe. But one thing mattered most: Cox admitted to killing Angie. He claimed that on November 18, 1993, he was driving near his mother's neighborhood when his car suddenly broke down. He got out to inspect the vehicle, and while he was doing so, a school bus pulled up nearby. Children stepped off, scattering toward their homes. All except one. Angie. According to Cox, she approached him, and they exchanged a few words. He said she looked cold, so he offered her a ride. She accepted. That's what he claimed. From there, Cox said he took Angie to a nearby Burger King and then back to his home. Over the course of the following days, he admitted to holding her captive and sexually assaulting her. And when he was done, when he decided it was time, he drove her to a wooded area. There, he said, he tied her to a tree. Alive. And left her. Detectives listened in grim silence, but skepticism was thick in the air. Angie lived just a short distance from where the bus dropped her off. The idea that she would willingly get into a stranger's car didn't sit right. And the story about the car breaking down? Cox said it stalled, yet somehow started up again just as Angie appeared. Too convenient. Too contrived. It was far more likely that Cox had been watching, waiting. That he targeted Angie deliberately and lured or forced her into his vehicle. The story he told was filled with holes, but he had admitted to the murder, and that was enough to finally close the case. In August 2020, more than 2 decades after Angie's life was stolen, Cox was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But justice came too late for Angie's mother. She had died in 2016 after a long battle with cancer, never getting to see the man responsible for her daughter's death brought to justice. Angie's father, Ronald, told reporters that Cox had killed his wife, too, not with his hands, but with the weight of grief. She was never the same after Angie disappeared. The light had left her. And in time, so did life. But Cox's story didn't end there. After his confession, the prosecutor reopened a disturbing old case, one involving the sexual abuse of 2 7-year-old girls. Cox had served only a year for that crime, a slap on the wrist for the trauma he caused. Now, with the spotlight back on him, the police reached out to one of the girls, now an adult, and asked if she would testify. She agreed. Confronted with her bravery and the evidence, Cox confessed once again. This time, he was handed an additional 10 years in prison. In court, the woman stood and faced the man who had once taken her childhood. But instead of despair, she spoke with strength. She told the courtroom that despite everything Cox had done, she had gone on to live a life of joy, love, and purpose. She would be free. He would never be. Now, the story of Angie Houseman, the little girl who vanished on her walk home, has a conclusion, tragic, painful, and long overdue. And yet, as one chapter closed, another horrifying one opened. Because in a quiet Kentucky town, another family was about to face their worst nightmare. Gabby Doolin was just 9 years old, born on December 26, 2007, in the close-knit community of Scottsville. It was a town where neighbors knew each other by name, where the rhythm of life followed farming seasons and high school football games. Entertainment was scarce, but school sports, especially soccer and football, were everything. For Gabby and her 2 older brothers, sports weren't just an activity. They were a way of life. It was November 2015 when the town buzzed with excitement for the biggest football game of the year. Gabby's older brother was on the team, and she proudly wore her cheerleading uniform, ready to cheer him on. Her parents, Brian and Amy, had originally planned to leave Gabby at home, but she begged to go. They gave in. The stands were packed, energy high. Gabby was excited to see her friends. She asked her mom if she could play with them near the stadium. Amy said yes but reminded her to stay close. Gabby ran off, bouncing between her friends and her parents, a bundle of joy and laughter. At one point, she asked her dad for money for snacks, then disappeared into the crowd of kids again. Everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. Later that evening, Gabby's friends returned to the stands, without her. Amy looked around, confused. Gabby wasn't among them. The girl said they'd been playing hide and seek. Gabby had been, tasked with finding them. They were hiding in the restroom area. But Gabby never came. After waiting, they went to look for her. No luck. That's when they came to Amy. Panic set in instantly. Amy ran to find Brian, and together they started searching. First around the stands. Then the snack bar. Then the restrooms. No trace of Gabby. They rushed to the announcer's booth and made an announcement, hoping Gabby would hear and come running. But there was only silence. And just like that, another innocent child had vanished. Brian and Amy refused to let panic paralyze them. Even as fear gripped their hearts, they kept moving, asking anyone and everyone if they'd seen their daughter, Gabby. People nearby, sensing the desperation in their voices, began to join the search. The once cheerful atmosphere of the local baseball game turned tense, with scattered groups combing through the grounds calling out Gabby's name. They didn't stop there. Brian and Amy pleaded with stadium staff to turn on the floodlights, hoping that a brighter field might help reveal where Gabby had gone. The workers complied. The area lit up like daylight, casting long shadows that only made the woods behind the field look darker, more ominous. That's where they focused next. A small patch of forest that bordered the ballpark, often ignored and unremarkable on most days, now felt like it was holding its breath. The couple, joined by volunteers, pushed through the brush and called out again. But there was no answer. Gabby was still gone. 15 minutes had passed. Every parent knows that when a child disappears, the minutes stretch like hours, and each one is dangerous. With hearts racing and no sign of their daughter, Brian and Amy made the call they were dreading. The police were on their way. When the officers arrived, they immediately understood the gravity of the situation. A missing child wasn't just urgent, it was rare and terrifying, especially in a quiet town like theirs. The possibility that Gabby had simply wandered off was rapidly shrinking. The signs pointed towards something far worse, a kidnapping. A crime like that, against a child, was unthinkable, and yet, it was unfolding before their eyes. The officers made a swift, chilling decision. The game had to be stopped. The stadium was locked down. Nobody would leave. If the abductor was still among them, blending into the crowd, they couldn't risk letting him escape. Without raising alarms or sparking chaos, police quietly secured all exits and began questioning those present. Meanwhile, additional officers and state troopers expanded the search to the school grounds adjacent to the field. It was there, in a patch of woods not far from a small creek, that one officer stumbled upon something that made the world stop spinning. A small, lifeless body. Gabby. An ambulance arrived quickly, but hope had long since slipped away. Her body was transported to the medical examiner, where the cause of death was determined, asphyxiation. There were bruises on her neck. Her clothes were partially missing. The implications were horrifying. The crime was not only violent, it was depraved. Amy saw the flashing ambulance lights and rushed toward them, her instincts telling her the worst had happened. Officers intercepted her. They couldn't let her see what they had found. Some tragedies are too cruel for a mother's eyes. Back at the stadium, the investigation intensified. Detectives moved everyone to the school gymnasium. If the monster who did this was still inside, they needed to isolate and study him. They sat down with Brian and Amy, trying to piece together any suspicions, anyone who might have held a grudge, anything unusual. But the couple had no answers, no enemies. Just an empty space where their daughter used to be. They turned to Gabby's young friends, hoping children might remember what adults overlooked. The detectives asked gently but firmly, had anyone followed them? Watched them? Did they see anyone strange? The girls struggled to recall anything meaningful, until one of them hesitated. She remembered a man near the restroom. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. Quiet. Watching. What stuck in her mind was his denim jacket. That detail gave the police something to chase. A man in denim. They questioned the ticket booth worker, who also recalled someone who seemed out of place, possibly drunk, definitely off, and yes, wearing a denim jacket. The police checked the registry of known sex offenders. Nothing matched. They visited nearby offenders, but all had alibis. The case seemed to be drifting, until whispers started floating around the gym. A name. Timothy Madden. Locals recognized him. He was there at the game. But people said he was acting odd. Off. His son was playing, yet Timothy barely paid attention. That was strange. He was usually the kind of dad who cheered louder than anyone. That night, he seemed distant, distracted. Like his mind was somewhere else entirely. One of the witnesses, a relative, mentioned how Timothy's behavior gave him a bad feeling. That feeling grew stronger when another person said they'd seen him near the restroom. The same place where Gabby had last been seen. And he'd been wearing a denim jacket. The evidence was far from conclusive, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. The police knew it was time. Most of the attendees had been allowed to go home, but one man was still on their list. As night fell, they prepared to pay a visit to Timothy Madden. They weren't ready to accuse, but they were more than ready to ask the kind of questions no one ever wants to hear. Because in the silence that followed Gabby's last breath, the truth was out there, and it was darker than anyone had imagined. The local police chief was no stranger to Timothy Madden. They'd grown up in the same small town, even shared a few childhood memories. So when detectives came knocking on his office door, asking questions about Timothy's possible involvement in a brutal crime, the chief hesitated. He vouched for him. Said Timothy wasn't the type. Sure, he had a few traffic tickets, the kind most folks pick up over the years, but nothing serious, nothing that hinted at the darkness behind Gabby's murder. Still, procedure demanded action. The detectives headed over to Timothy's house, a modest home tucked away on a quiet street, shared with his wife and their 5 children. When he opened the door, the officers were met with a man who looked more confused than concerned. They asked if he knew why they were there. Timothy paused, then nodded slowly. Yes, he'd heard about Gabby. No, he didn't have anything to do with it. But the investigators were prepared to shake the tree a little. They hinted at evidence, a supposed video, they claimed, showing Timothy and Gabby talking shortly before she was killed. The truth? There was no video. It was a bluff, a classic tactic to prompt a crack. At first, Timothy stood firm, denying any knowledge. Then his story began to shift. Yes, he admitted, he had spoken to Gabby. Said it happened near the stadium the night she vanished. According to Timothy, he'd stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. A few girls had run past, laughing and yelling as they played hide and seek. Gabby, trailing behind, stopped to ask if he'd seen where her friends had gone. He said he pointed in the direction they'd run. She thanked him and left. It was a convenient story, too convenient. The detectives weren't buying it. He'd just placed himself at the last known location where Gabby had been seen, minutes before she disappeared. And yet, no one else had seen Timothy out there that night. No witnesses. No one to confirm his alibi. Suspicion deepened. The officers requested Timothy's clothing from that night and a DNA sample. He agreed without a fight. But when they examined the garments, a pair of jeans, a denim jacket, and underwear, something didn't sit right. There were stains. Reddish ones. When asked, Timothy dismissed them. Just stains, he said. A mistake. But detectives had their doubts. While the lab processed the samples, investigators followed every thread. The autopsy confirmed what everyone feared: Gabby had been strangled. The brutality of it only hardened the resolve to find her killer. Then, a twist, a letter, slipped anonymously into the hands of the police. It spoke of a suspicious man seen at the game, describing not just the man's car, but his license plate. That was all detectives needed to track him down. He turned out to be a student, living about 30 minutes from Scottsville. But when confronted, he was as stunned as the detectives had been hopeful. He said he wasn't at the game. Had never heard of Gabby. And his alibi? Solid. He'd been at work, and his boss confirmed it. The lead went cold. The letter's origin remained a mystery. Was it a prank? Or worse, an attempt to mislead? Then came another lead, closer to home and far more troubling. A few townspeople reported strange behavior from a 16-year-old boy named Bo. At first, he claimed he'd gone to the game. Later, he said he hadn't. It was the inconsistency that caught attention. That, and one disturbing detail, Bo was Timothy Madden's son. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered a violent incident between Bo and his father just 2 weeks before Gabby's death. A heated argument had escalated. Bo had allegedly held a knife to his father's throat, threatening to kill him. The air around the Madden household now felt heavy with secrets. Investigators tried to speak with Bo, but being a minor, they needed parental consent. His mother refused to allow DNA collection. The investigation hit a wall. Still, the story had already begun to leak. In a town like Scottsville, news spreads like wildfire. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into rumors. Some suspected one of the Madden boys. Others pointed fingers at Timothy. Was he covering for one of his sons? Was it all some tragic, tangled family secret? Even Gabby's parents were torn. They knew the Maddens. Had known them for years. Their kids had grown up together, football, cheerleading, school events, Friday nights at the stadium. The families had sat side by side in the bleachers. Could the Maddens really be hiding a killer? Then things escalated. Timothy's eldest son, just 20, took to social media, launching threats at the officers, lashing out with rage. The police couldn't ignore it. He was arrested swiftly, and during the booking process, an outstanding warrant surfaced. He was wanted in another town, accused of assaulting a teenage girl. Questioned about Gabby's murder, he denied involvement, claimed his anger stemmed from the accusations leveled at his family. He had an alibi. He said he was with his cousin the night Gabby died, and he agreed to a DNA test, seemingly eager to clear his name. The small town gathered to mourn Gabby 6 days after she was taken. Hundreds showed up. Some came to grieve, others to show support, and some simply to be part of something that had shaken the community to its core. They raised funds for her family, lit candles, shared stories. But behind the solemn faces, the fear lingered. Scottsville was no longer the quiet town it once was. A killer still walked among them, and the shadow surrounding the Madden family grew darker with every passing day. The grief was still fresh. Gabby's family had barely begun making arrangements for her funeral when a quiet storm was brewing in the forensic lab. The DNA results had finally come back. Timothy Madden and his son's samples had been compared against the biological evidence gathered from the crime scene. The blood. The semen. The science was relentless. And the match was undeniable. The samples taken from Gabby's body were Timothy's. Every strand of his DNA clung to the truth he could no longer run from. The blood on his clothes, it was hers. Detectives wasted no time. Brian and Amy, still drowning in sorrow, were called in and told what they already feared but had hoped wasn't true. Gabby's killer had been found. While her parents tried to absorb the unbearable, police knocked on Timothy Madden's door. And before the man could process what was happening, cold steel was wrapped around his wrists. On the way to the station, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, Timothy yelled that he was innocent. His voice cracked under the weight of panic. He offered a strange explanation, the blood on his clothing wasn't Gabby's, it was his own, from scratching himself while climbing through a fence. But his earlier story to the police had been different. Then, he had claimed it wasn't blood at all. Just mud. His lies had already begun to unravel. The DNA, however, didn't lie. With the evidence airtight, the prosecution prepared for trial, announcing they would seek the death penalty. But Timothy's defense pushed back, claiming their client had nothing to do with the murder. They questioned the credibility of the evidence and claimed that Timothy had been at the stadium the entire time, filming the game. Yet Timothy himself had told detectives he'd seen Gabby that night. His lawyer argued that if Gabby's body had been found in a creek, how could Timothy's clothes still be dry when he returned? His mother backed him up, saying he came home clean, calm, and behaving normally. But no one could ignore the semen. It was found on Gabby's body. It matched Timothy. There was no innocent explanation for that. And with that, all his defenses collapsed. Investigators believed there was a disturbing layer of truth hidden in Timothy's shifting stories. Perhaps he had, in fact, been at the stadium. But maybe he slipped away during the game. Maybe he saw Gabby wandering, looking for her friend. Maybe she approached him, someone she trusted, and asked if he'd seen them. That's when he might have lied. Maybe he told her they went into the woods behind the field, and he could take her there. Maybe she followed him. And maybe, just a few hundred meters from the safety of the school, he attacked her. Years passed. In 2019, talks of a plea deal began. The prosecution offered to drop the death penalty in exchange for a confession. Life in prison. No chance of ever walking free again. Brian and Amy agreed. The thought of enduring a full trial, being forced to sit through every horrifying detail, was more than they could bear. They didn't want to spend months reliving Gabby's murder in open court. Eventually, Timothy accepted the deal. He admitted his guilt. But the agreement didn't require him to describe what he did. No details. No explanation. Just 2 words, "I'm guilty." It wasn't enough for Gabby's family. They needed to hear what really happened. They needed to understand. In court, emotions boiled over. Brian, devastated and furious, shouted across the courtroom at the man who had taken his daughter. The judge had to step in. The trial was briefly halted. The 2 men were separated. Timothy Madden was sentenced to life in prison, where he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, in a maximum security facility. But for Gabby's family, justice was only a word. It couldn't bring her back. It couldn't erase what he did. And it couldn't silence the questions that still haunted them every night. The night began like any other. Deanna was home with her mother, Doreen, when a knock at the front door shattered the stillness. As Doreen turned the knob, the door creaked open to reveal a figure no one could ever forget, a man in a grotesque wolf mask, gripping a knife, his voice low and chilling. "I'm going to kill you now," he said. Doreen screamed, her instinct kicking in as she turned to her daughter and shouted, "Run! Get out now!" But Deanna, terrified beyond reason, dove behind the sofa, her body trembling, her mind frozen in place. What happened next was a blur. She couldn't recall the screams, the scuffle, the blood. Her memory, mercifully or cruelly, went black. She stayed hidden in that same spot, too scared to move, until her father returned and found her, wide-eyed and mute, still cowering. When Deanna finally spoke, she could say only one thing for certain: the man wore a wolf mask. Beyond that, she remembered nothing. His face, his voice, his hands, none of it stuck. Just the mask, and the knife. At first, suspicion naturally turned to Doreen's husband, Charles. He had left the house shortly before the attack, allegedly for a quick trip to the store. But something about his return raised eyebrows. He had blood on his clothes, and investigators noted he had apparently stepped in it multiple times, even fallen in it. Was this clumsiness, or a calculated attempt to mask guilt? But the details didn't add up. The bloody shoe prints didn't match Charles's shoes. No traces of blood were found in his car. Surveillance footage from the store backed up his story. Charles had indeed been buying candy around the time of the attack. The timeline was too tight for him to have committed the murder. Eventually, detectives cleared him. That's when the investigation took a darker turn. When asked if anyone might hold a grudge against Doreen, Charles didn't hesitate. Michael, Doreen's ex-husband. Charles explained that Michael had once seemed stable, even after the divorce. But that changed drastically after the tragic death of their son. Michael became convinced that Doreen had something to do with it, that she had taken their child from him, both in life and in death. He filed a civil lawsuit, accusing her of wrongful death. He lost, but he never let it go. Michael had always struggled with depression, even before their son was born. The death only deepened his isolation. He withdrew from the world, consumed by grief and bitterness. When Doreen remarried, that bitterness calcified into hatred. He saw Charles not just as a new husband, but as the man who had replaced him, who had taken everything. Then Michael lost his job, the one stable thing he had left. According to Charles, that's when he truly unraveled. Detectives took it seriously. Michael lived just 2 miles from Doreen. That alone was enough to warrant a visit. Around midnight, they pulled up outside his home. A pickup truck sat in the driveway. A flashlight beam through the window revealed something ominous, what looked like blood on the steering wheel and keys. They knocked. No answer. But lights were on, and water was running inside. It wasn't until their persistent knocking turned urgent that Michael finally opened the door. He appeared calm, even cooperative. When told about Doreen's murder, he didn't flinch. He invited the officers in, waived his right to a warrant, and even offered to sign consent for a search. But as he reached for the pen, detectives noticed something. His right hand was badly cut, the kind of deep wound one might sustain in a struggle. Michael casually explained he'd been carving pumpkins for Halloween. The blood was still fresh. An officer accompanied him upstairs to retrieve his ID. In the bedroom, Michael reached under the bed. The officer stopped him, and found a loaded gun hidden beneath the headboard. Meanwhile, downstairs, other officers found something even more disturbing, drops of blood leading into the garage. There, next to a washing machine, they discovered blood-soaked clothing. The machine itself reeked of bleach and metallic tang. That was enough for an arrest. But the discoveries didn't end there. Inside Michael's home, forensic investigators uncovered more. An empty box that once held an 18-inch machete. Medical experts would later confirm the weapon matched Doreen's wounds almost perfectly. In the basement, they found 2 crude, handmade coffins. One for Doreen, the other, they feared, for Charles. And then, perhaps most disturbingly, they discovered mortuary bags. Not something you'd expect to find in an ordinary suburban home. These were the kind used by paramedics and funeral workers. Why would Michael need those? To police, the answer seemed chillingly obvious. But despite the mounting evidence, it wasn't enough. Not yet. A judge reviewed the case and found too many unknowns, too many gaps in the story. Michael was detained, but not formally charged. The case was far from over, but one thing was certain: behind that calm demeanor and pumpkin-carving alibi, Michael had secrets. And the wolf mask was just the beginning. He was released, freed after just 3 days into the investigation. But those days were enough for the detectives to receive crucial lab results, results that would forever alter the case. The blood found at the crime scene didn't match just one person, but 2. The majority of it was Doreen's, but a smaller amount belonged to Michael. The discovery sent a chill through the investigation. Michael had injured himself during the brutal attack on his ex-wife. A judge wasted no time, issuing an arrest warrant for Michael, charging him with the cold-blooded murder of Doreen and her unborn child. As the investigation deepened, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Interviews with Michael's acquaintances revealed unsettling details. He was the owner of the wolf mask found near Doreen's house, a mask he had been photographed wearing at a Halloween party not long before. The police didn't need to search far, they found the same mask in his home. The trail of evidence was becoming undeniable. The trial began in July 1988, nearly 3 years after Doreen's tragic death. Michael's defense was as unexpected as it was chilling. Initially, he confessed to the crime, but soon after, his story took a strange turn. He claimed to be innocent, pleading insanity. A psychologist assigned to evaluate him found that, indeed, Michael suffered from a serious mental illness. According to him, it was Halloween night that broke him. He recalled seeing children trick-or-treating, which reminded him of the death of his son, Paul. That reminder, he said, drove him into madness. On that fateful night, Michael said he went to Doreen's house with a machete in hand. When she opened the door, he shouted, "You killed my son," and without hesitation, attacked. Doreen, recognizing the man behind the mask, screamed for her daughter to run, but Michael was already upon her. However, his story carried one crucial detail that raised suspicion. He claimed not to know that Doreen was pregnant. Yet, everyone who knew her could clearly see she was. Her friends had even joked about how much larger she had become. The prosecution tore into Michael's story. They argued he knew exactly what he was doing when he murdered Doreen and her unborn child. In fact, Michael had openly talked about his desire to kill her in the weeks before the attack. And it wasn't just talk. Detectives found evidence of elaborate preparations in his home, including 2 coffins and body bags. Yet, something stopped him from carrying out the murder exactly as he had planned. The prosecution speculated that Michael may have feared getting caught. One of the key witnesses in the case was Doreen's young daughter, Deanna. At only 9 years old, she was a direct witness to the horrors of that night and the aftermath that followed. Her testimony, though painful, helped seal Michael's fate. After years of investigation and trial, Michael was convicted of murder. The judge sentenced him to death, but a moratorium on executions in California kept him alive in prison, his fate uncertain. For Deanna, the trauma lingered far beyond the trial. Yet, in a move that shocked many, she chose to forgive Michael and attempt to move on with her life. Meanwhile, another chilling case emerged, the disappearance of 8-year-old Kirsten Hatfield. Kirsten was born in 1989 in Midwest City, Oklahoma. Her early life was marked by hardship, as her father abandoned the family shortly after her birth. Kirsten and her mother, Shannon, moved in with her grandparents. As she grew older, Shannon remarried, and the family tried to create a new life. But the new family dynamic wasn't enough to prevent further strain, and Shannon found herself raising Kirsten and her younger sister, Faith, alone after her second marriage ended. The night of May 13, 1997, would be the last time anyone saw Kirsten alive. That night, Shannon read bedtime stories to Faith, but since Faith had already fallen asleep, she simply kissed Kirsten goodnight and left their bedroom door slightly open. It was a ritual she had followed for years, in case the girls needed her. But when Shannon woke in the middle of the night, she heard a noise from their room. Thinking her daughters were awake, she went to check. By the time she reached their door, the noise had stopped. Assuming they were just settling back to sleep, Shannon didn't investigate further. However, something caught her attention as she turned to leave. The door was completely closed. She always left it slightly ajar. Had one of the girls closed it, or had she forgotten? She opened the door a crack but didn't go in, returning to her room for the night. The next morning, Shannon went to wake her children, but when she entered their room, she only found Faith in bed. She asked Faith about Kirsten, but Faith had no idea where her sister was. Panic began to rise as Shannon searched the house and the neighborhood, calling friends and family, but no one had seen Kirsten. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Shannon called 911. At first, The police thought Kirsten might be hiding somewhere in the house or had wandered off, but as they began to investigate, it became clear that something far darker was at play. The mystery of Kirsten's disappearance had just begun, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would surface, shattering the small town and leaving a mother to wonder if she would ever see her daughter again. It was just after dawn when officers arrived at the modest home nestled on the outskirts of town. The early morning light cast long shadows across the front yard, where nothing seemed out of place, until they reached the side of the house. There, a single window sat slightly ajar. A few dark red droplets of blood dotted the frame. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set off alarm bells. As investigators combed the area, just a few feet from the window, they made a chilling discovery: a small, blood-stained piece of children's underwear. It was fragile, soaked in fear and heartbreak. They brought it to Shannon, the mother of 4-year-old Kirsten Hatfield, who had been reported missing hours earlier. Her reaction was immediate. Tearfully, she confirmed it: those belonged to her daughter. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing person case, it was a possible abduction. The police escalated their response, calling in more officers, more resources. They began canvassing the neighborhood, hoping someone, anyone, had seen or heard something. But everyone claimed the night had been quiet. Peaceful. Ordinary. Except for one thing. A neighbor, awakened around 3 a.m., mentioned hearing a dog barking, an unusual disturbance at that hour. That time coincided with Shannon's account. She had woken up at exactly 3 a.m. too, startled by a noise she couldn't place. When she checked on her daughters, she found only one of them in bed. Kirsten was gone. The remaining witness was only 3 years old, Kirsten's little sister, Faith. A child psychologist was called in to gently question her. Faith had only one sentence to offer. "A bad man came and took my sister." That single sentence was like a punch to the chest. The reality set in: Kirsten didn't wander off. She was taken. But by whom? There were no signs of forced entry beyond the cracked window. No strange footprints. No evidence of a break-in loud enough to wake the house. That meant one terrifying possibility: the abductor may have been someone Kirsten knew. Someone who didn't need to use force. Digging deeper into Shannon's background, investigators uncovered troubling information. She had a history of drug use, though she insisted she had been clean for years. Still, detectives had to consider everything. 2 grim theories emerged. 1. Shannon may have owed a debt to someone dangerous, and Kirsten had been taken as collateral. 2. In a more harrowing possibility, Shannon herself may have handed her daughter over voluntarily, to someone she trusted, or feared. Shannon denied it all. She looked the detectives in the eyes and swore she'd never hurt her child. She begged them to find her. Still, her past kept her under a cloud of suspicion. Without solid leads, the police turned to the public, releasing Kirsten's photo to the media and pleading for information. Hundreds of tips poured in. Most led nowhere. But one stood out. A woman contacted the police with a disturbing suspicion: she believed her boyfriend might be involved. He had been volatile lately. Aggressive. And he had a disturbing connection to the case. The man was known to Shannon's brother. In fact, the house where Shannon and her daughters lived used to belong to that same brother. That meant this man could have known the layout of the home. He could have slipped in. Taken Kirsten. Left without a trace. He also had a criminal history: drug abuse, assault charges, violent tendencies. It all seemed to fit. But there was a problem. He had an alibi. Several witnesses placed him at a bar until nearly 4 a.m. on the night of Kirsten's disappearance, too late to be the abductor. Another lead, another dead end. Months passed. Then years. The case grew cold. The town tried to move on. But Shannon couldn't. She turned her grief into determination. From the beginning, she fought, speaking to the media, passing out flyers, knocking on doors. She begged local businesses to display her daughter's photo. Most said no. She tried to speak to the state governor. She was ignored. She opened a small volunteer center, trying to build a task force of her own. But even there, darkness followed. People stole money. Others used Kirsten's story to gain fame. But Shannon never gave up. Eventually, she realized that being a grieving mother wasn't enough. If she truly wanted to find justice, she had to understand how the system worked. She enrolled in college. Studied criminology. Earned her degree. Became a probation officer. She wasn't just searching for her daughter anymore, she was protecting other children from monsters like the one who took Kirsten. Years later, Shannon is still haunted by what happened that night. She still searches. She still believes someone out there knows the truth. Maybe it's someone who lived nearby. Maybe it's someone who smiled to her face once. Police have reopened the case several times, always chasing new leads, always hoping for the one clue that will crack it open. Working with the FBI, they even created an age-progressed sketch of what Kirsten might look like now. But the question still lingers in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire. What happened to Kirsten Hatfield? And will we ever find out?
On November 18th, Angie went about her usual routine, attending school and finishing her classes by 3 p.m. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, she boarded the bus with a group of neighborhood kids. They made their way to their stop, but as the other children got off, Angie continued on alone. Her stop was just a short walk from there, so it wasn't unusual for her to walk the remaining distance home. But that afternoon, Angie never made it home. It wasn't like Angie to be late, and as the minutes ticked by, her parents began to worry. By 3:30 p.m., they decided to go looking for her, retracing her usual route from the bus stop to their house. As they walked, they spoke to other kids who had gotten off the bus with her. They confirmed that she had been walking toward home, but no one had seen her after that. The neighbors, who usually kept an eye on the children in the area, hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Angie's parents, now frantic, combed the neighborhood, calling her name and asking anyone they could find if they had seen their daughter. As the sky began to darken and the cold set in, they grew more desperate. By nightfall, there was no sign of Angie. With dread hanging in the air, her parents made the difficult decision to call the police. Officers arrived quickly, joining the search for the missing girl. The chilly evening seemed to rule out the idea that Angie had wandered off on her own. The police began to focus on the possibility of something far more sinister, especially given the recent kidnapping of another young girl in the same area. Just 10 days earlier, a man had attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl right after she got off the bus, dragging her into some bushes before she managed to escape. The man, still at large, became a prime suspect in Angie's disappearance. Police brought in tracking dogs trained to sniff out scents. They picked up Angie's scent near the bus stop and followed it for a while, but then, disturbingly, they lost the trail. The scent had abruptly disappeared, which led the police to believe that Angie might have gotten into a vehicle, further suggesting the possibility of an abduction. Helicopters with thermal sensors were brought in to search the area, and a team scoured the banks of a small stream nearby. But there was still no trace of Angie, no clues that could explain her sudden disappearance. As the search continued into the following day, the authorities reached out to the media, hoping the public could help. News outlets picked up the story, and within 24 hours, the police received over 300 tips. More than 20 additional officers were brought in to help process the growing pile of leads. Despite the overwhelming response, none of these tips brought them closer to finding Angie. Detectives turned their attention to Angie's stepfather. Though he denied any involvement, his position was scrutinized heavily. To clear his name, he agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed, and he urged the police to focus on finding Angie rather than pursuing any suspicions about him. Investigators also tracked down Angie's biological father, who had little to do with her life but had been seen driving past the house several times, watching Angie as she played outside. This behavior raised red flags, but after further investigation, he was ruled out as a suspect, his alibi checked out. By day 3, the FBI joined the case, pooling resources with the local police. They all came to the grim realization that something terrible had happened to Angie. She wouldn't have survived the freezing temperatures on her own. Then, on the morning of day 3, a new lead surfaced. A person reported a suspicious man driving slowly through Angie's neighborhood in a blue sedan. The description matched the one given by the girl who had narrowly escaped the previous abduction attempt. The police created a composite sketch of the suspect and aired it on the news. Flyers with the sketch were distributed across the area, but the man's identity remained elusive. As the case gained national attention, more tips flooded in, some even from psychics claiming to have visions of where Angie might be. One psychic went so far as to name a specific location, a large national park 25 miles away. But detectives were skeptical of these claims, not allowing themselves to be sidetracked by unverified leads. In a bid to generate more information, a reward of $10,000 was offered for anyone who could provide crucial information. This led to an influx of tips, but none that provided any real answers. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered a disturbing conversation from a few days before Angie's disappearance. She had told her teacher she was planning a nature trip with her uncle. But her parents had never heard of any such relative, and it seemed like Angie had invented the story. This raised further suspicions. Could she have known her abductor, someone she might have trusted enough to call uncle? Days passed with no progress. The investigation seemed to stall, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Angie alive grew slimmer. But on November 27, 9 days after Angie vanished, a hunter called the police with a shocking discovery. He had found a body in the woods of a nearby national park. When officers arrived at the scene, they were met with a horrific sight. A young girl's body was tied to a tree, naked, her head wrapped in tape with only her nose left exposed to the air. Her hands were bound with handcuffs, and near the body, a bag containing personal belongings was found. As the chilling reality set in, the search for answers became even more urgent. Every detail, every clue was now more important than ever.